Thank you for listening to the John Calvin podcast. For early access, bonus episodes, and a range of community benefits, sign up at johncalvinpod.com/support. That's johncalvinpod.com/support. Hi, everybody. Just to let you know, we're going to be taking a break from the Myth or Reality series we've been doing for 3 weeks. And today we're going to be diving into a new series looking at Michael Servetus. They are still coming up, but we're just taking a break for 3 weeks. Hope you enjoy them and speak soon. In a letter to the French pastors of Frankfurt, Calvin said this: "You have doubtless heard of the name of Servetus, a Spaniard who 20 years ago corrupted your Germany with a virulent publication filled with many pernicious errors. This worthless man, after being driven out of Germany and having concealed himself in France under a fictitious name, lately patched up a larger volume, partly from his former book and partly from new figments which he had invented. This book he printed secretly at Vienne, a town in the neighbourhood of Lyon. Many copies of it had been conveyed to Frankfurt for the Easter fairs. The printer's agent, however, a pious and worthy man, on being informed that it contained nothing but a farrago of errors, suppressed whatever he had of it. It would take too long to relate with how many errors, indeed prodigious blasphemies against God, the book abounds. Figure for yourselves a rhapsody patched up from the impious ravings of all ages. There is no form of impiety which this monster has not raked up as if from the infernal regions. I had rather you should pass sentence on it from reading the book itself. You will certainly find on almost every single page something that will fill you with horror. The author himself is held in prison by our magistrates, and he will be punished before long, I hope. But it is your duty to see to it that this pestiferous poison does not spread further." So it's safe to say that John Calvin was not a fan of Michael Servetus. But today I'm excited to say that we're going to be starting a showdown series where we look at the various people that Calvin clashed and debated with. And because Michael Servetus is so huge in shaping Calvin's reputation, usually in a negative way, I thought it would be good to have a few episodes dedicated just to understanding the Servetus episode a bit better. So that's what we're going to be doing in this series. Now, for those who might not be familiar with Servetus, he was a Spaniard born in the same year as Calvin in 1509. But the reason that Servetus is so tightly bound up with Calvin's name is because on the 27th of October 1553, Servetus is burned at the stake in Geneva for heresy. And this is one of those episodes that is regularly kind of thrown out there by detractors of Calvin to say that this is evidence that he was a terrible human being, that he was a dictator of Geneva. The reality, as we will see, is actually far more complex. And in reality, Calvin doesn't come out of this as the evil ogre that he's often presented as, but I'll come back to that. So Servetus, like Calvin, is extremely bright. In fact, he's credited with being one of the first to accurately write about the circulation of the blood. Unlike Calvin, however, Servetus becomes one of the most famous and notorious heretics in Europe. He writes vigorously against the doctrine of the Trinity and against the idea that Jesus was a distinct divine person in the Godhead. Needless to say that writing things like this in Servetus's day was extremely dangerous, and the vast majority of people in 16th century Europe agree that the penalty for believing the things that Servetus does ought to be death. So Servetus is very bright, and he goes off to study at the University of Saragossa. He's educated in Latin, philosophy, logic, maths, that sort of thing. He gets his BA in 1523. Then, in order to get his MA, Servetus is required to be kind of like a support teacher. And it's at this point that you can arguably begin to see some of maybe the instability in Servetus's personality. So one of his teachers during the MA is a chap called Gaspar Lax. And in 1527, Servetus gets into a full-blown brawl with Lax. We don't know exactly why they get into a brawl, but suffice it to say that brawling with your lecturers and teachers is probably not the wisest idea for career development. Servetus is expelled, and because of Lax's connections across Spain, Servetus struggles to get a job in Spain, and eventually he gets out of Spain and he ends up in France at the University of Toulouse, where he studies law. In 1530, Servetus gets a job working as the secretary to the emperor's confessor. He attends Charles V's coronation as the Holy Roman Emperor in Bologna, and Servetus is absolutely appalled by the luxury and excess that he sees in the church, and particularly with the Pope's entourage. Servetus leaves his job as secretary to the emperor's confessor. He spends a bit of time in the reformed cities of Basel and Strasbourg. He begins to experiment with putting his anti-Trinitarian ideas out there, but as you can expect, this does not go down well. He meets with Calvin's mentor, the great German reformer we've spoken about before, called Martin Bucer. But Servetus plows on and publishes a book called On the Errors of the Trinity, which again is a very, very dangerous thing to do in that time. Eventually, he goes off to Paris to study medicine, and Servetus opens a medical practice after this in the French city of Vienne. He gets into another brawl with a rival doctor, like you do. And Servetus gets absolutely obsessed with Calvin during these years, and is kind of unhinged in the amount of letters that he sends to Calvin. It's kind of like trolling before trolling was a thing. They exchange increasingly heated letters. Servetus sends Calvin an early copy of his shockingly heretical book, The Restoration of Christianity, which again questions the Trinity and other core doctrines of the Christian faith. Calvin is appalled and replies by sending to Servetus a copy of his magnum opus, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. So there's lots of sending books back and forth, that sort of thing. And Servetus promptly returns Calvin's Institutes to him, full of annotations and abusive messages about where he thinks Calvin has gone wrong. And eventually Calvin gets so fed up with Servetus that he just cuts off the correspondence and stops responding. But Servetus keeps sending letter after letter after letter to Calvin, which Calvin continues to ignore. And eventually Calvin informs the authorities in Vienne that they are harbouring a notorious heretic under an assumed name. Servetus is arrested, but he dramatically escapes the prison. And then Servetus makes the most catastrophic decision of his life, and that is the decision to go to Calvin's Geneva. We will never know Servetus's motive for doing this. Does Servetus hope that because Geneva is a reformed city that it might be more favourable to him as a heretic? That seems unlikely given the animosity between Servetus and Calvin and the general atmosphere in the Swiss Confederation. Is Servetus deliberately courting martyrdom? I think this is perhaps more likely given the scrapes that Servetus has got into in the past and his generally being a bit unhinged. Is Servetus delusional and maybe even hoping that his presence in Geneva might result in Calvin getting into trouble or even being thrown out? I think this is, again, very likely, given Servetus's personality, that he's hoping that he can show the Genevans, maybe, that Calvin is just another pope, like another instrument of religious oppression. We'll be looking at Servetus's trial in more detail in the next episodes, but he does try during the trial to say Calvin is actually the bad guy here and Calvin should be condemned and put to death instead of me. In contrast to that, Calvin says that he doesn't mind the insults that Servetus has been directing at him because, quote, they were like the barking of a dog at a pile of manure. So Calvin's not too fussed about being insulted necessarily. And just 2 hours before the burning of Servetus, Calvin says to him, I do not hate you, I do not despise you, and I did not want to be hard in pursuit of you. So make of that what you will. The key thing to note really is that heresy of the kind that Servetus is putting out there was acknowledged as being worthy of death across Europe in the early modern period. An effigy of Servetus was burned in Vienne after he escaped, and all of the Protestant Swiss churches advised the Genevan authorities to execute Servetus. So the issues being dealt with in Geneva when Servetus arrives there are being wrestled with by the whole of Christendom. And that's important to remember because Calvin seems to get picked out in this sort of debate. But the truth is that most early modern people would agree that Servetus deserved to die. And while this is shocking and appalling to us, it's worth remembering that the idea of calling yourself like a Christian country or a Christian republic and not punishing heresy would have been unthinkable in Calvin's day. Would Servetus have had a better time of it in, say, France, Spain, England than what he got in Geneva? No. So I'd say it's important to not have double standards when we assess Calvin in the Servetus episode, especially because, as we will see when we come back to look at the trial of Servetus in more detail, Calvin actually wants Servetus to be shown mercy and pushes for leniency, but because of the politics in Geneva and the resentment that the city authorities have to Calvin, they decide that they want to burn Servetus anyway and go ahead and do it, even when Calvin pushes for a more merciful form of execution by the sword rather than by burning. So we'll look at that more next week. Thank you so much for listening, and if you are so excited by this series that you can't wait till next week, you can become a friend of the podcast and binge the whole series in one go if you'd like to do that. You can do it at johncalvinpod.com/support. See you next week.